The wind had a bite to it that promised a hard winter. It was a scavenger, that wind, picking the last stubborn leaves from the cottonwoods and scouring the high, barren ridges until they were nothing but bone-white stone and shadow. It was the kind of wind that got inside a man, a cold reminder of all the empty spaces he carried. For Silas Blackwood, the emptiness was vast. His cabin sat hunched against the base of a low mesa, a solitary sentinel at the frayed edge of the settlement they called Harmony Gulch. The name was a bitter joke. There was no harmony here, only a raw and desperate truce with the land and with each other. The cabin was small, built by his own hands from rough-hewn pine, the gaps chinked with mud and straw against the coming cold. Inside, it held the spare furnishings of a man who had shed the world, a hard-packed cot, a stone fireplace that was the cabin's heart, a single chair, and a crude table. On a small shelf sat a worn Bible he never opened and a half-empty bottle of whiskey he visited too often. Silas moved with the deliberate, stiff gait of a man well acquainted with pain. A piece of shrapnel from a skirmish that no one would ever write about had left his left leg a map of knotted scars and a source of constant, grinding ache. The cold made it worse, a fire that burned low and deep in the bone. But the wound people saw was the least of his burdens. The deeper wounds were the ones he carried behind his eyes, memories of smoke and screams, of the metallic taste of fear, and of the faces of men, both his and theirs, caught in the final, surprised moment of life's departure. He had worn the blue of the cavalry, ridden hard under a banner of progress, and had seen that progress measured in blood and sorrow. When his time was done, he had come west not to seek a fortune, but to lose himself. His days were a ritual of survival. He would rise before the sun painted the eastern cliffs, his breath pluming in the frigid air of the cabin. He'd check his snares, chop wood until his shoulders screamed in protest, and sit for hours on a rocky outcrop, his rifle across his lap, watching. He wasn't watching for anything in particular, just watching. It was a habit from the war, the instinct of a man who knew that the quietest moments were often the most dangerous. He spoke to no one but his horse, a stoic gray gelding named Ghost, and then only in low murmurs that the wind snatched away. He was a phantom, a ghost himself, haunting the edge of a world he no longer felt a part of. The settlement of Harmony Gulch was a half-mile down the dusty track, a sorry collection of clapboard buildings huddled around a trading post and a saloon. He went there only when necessary, for flour, salt, and cartridges, enduring the looks of the townsfolk. To them, he was the broken soldier, a man who had seen the elephant and come back changed, haunted. They gave him a wide berth, a mixture of pity and fear in their eyes. He preferred it that way. Solitude was his penance and his peace. On this day, the wind carried more than the chill of coming winter. It carried a tension, a palpable unease that prickled the back of Silas's neck. He had ridden Ghost into the settlement for kerosene and saw it immediately. The men were gathered in a tight, anxious knot in front of Henderson's trading post, their faces grim. The women and children were indoors, shutters drawn tight. It was a silence that was louder than any noise. Then he saw them. At the far end of the single dusty street, a delegation of Apache warriors sat on their ponies. They were still as the stones around them, their dark, unreadable eyes fixed on the settlement. They were not painted for war, but their presence was a weapon in itself. They wore buckskin leggings and simple hide shirts, their long black hair held back by leather bands. The man at their head, who seemed to be their leader, held a long, unadorned lance, its tip catching the pale autumn sun. It was a symbol of parley, but it looked no less deadly. Silas felt the old, familiar coldness seep into his gut. The past few months had been bloody. A dispute over grazing rights had escalated into raids, and raids had escalated into a massacre. Settlers and Apache alike had been slain, and a fragile, hateful peace had been brokered only a week ago. This was the fulfillment of that treaty. Henderson, The portly, self-important man who served as the settlement's de facto mayor stepped forward. He held his hands out, palms open, a gesture that looked clumsy and false. The Apache leader dismounted, his movements fluid and deliberate. They spoke for a long time, Henderson's voice a nervous rumble, the Apaches a series of guttural sounds that were as alien to the landscape as the clapboard buildings themselves. Silas stayed by his horse, wanting no part of it. He had seen enough treaties, enough promises made with forked tongues, but he couldn't look away. The Apache leader gave a sharp nod, and two of his warriors rode to the back of their small procession. They returned, leading a single horse. On the horse sat a girl. A silence fell over the street, deeper than before. The wind itself seemed to hold its breath. She was Apache. That was clear from her high cheekbones and the copper tone of her skin. But she was unlike any woman Silas had ever seen. She wore a simple dress of finely tanned doe skin, decorated with intricate patterns of dyed porcupine quills. Her hair, black as a raven's wing, was parted in the middle and fell in two thick braids that hung past her waist. But it was her face, her eyes, that arrested him. Her features were delicate, yet possessed a strength that seemed carved from the surrounding rock. And her eyes, they were dark, almond-shaped, and held a fire that defied her situation. As she slid from the horse's back with a liquid grace, those eyes swept over the crowd of white men. There was no fear in them. There was no submission. There was only a fierce, unyielding pride and a contempt so profound it was almost regal. She was the treaty, the peace bride, a human sacrifice offered up to appease the white man's anger and seal a broken peace. It was an old custom, one the settlers whispered about with a mix of revulsion and morbid curiosity. A woman given to the enemy, a hostage to ensure the truce held. The men of Harmony Gulch stared, their expressions a crude mix of suspicion, lust, and hostility. They saw a savage, a heathen, a potential spy in their midst. Some saw a prize, a spoil of war. Silas saw a young woman being led to the gallows, her head held high, a wave of something he hadn't felt in years. A hot, righteous anger surged through him. He turned to leave, to get back to the cold comfort of his cabin. But Henderson's voice stopped him. "Blackwood, a word." Silas turned slowly, his hand resting near the butt of the Colt peacemaker at his hip. Henderson waddled towards him, his face slick with sweat despite the cold. He was flanked by two other town elders, Miller, a wiry rancher with cruel eyes, and Peters, a blacksmith whose arms were as thick as tree limbs. "This concerns you," Henderson said, his voice low and conspiratorial. "I don't see how," Silas replied, his voice a gravelly rasp from disuse. "My business is my own." "Not anymore," Miller sneered. "This peace, it's a fragile thing. The Apache chief, he insists. One of our men must take the girl to show good faith." Silas's eyes flickered to the girl. She stood alone in the middle of the street, a solitary, defiant figure. The Apache warriors had already mounted their ponies, their duty done. They were leaving her. "Then one of you fine, God-fearing men can do it," Silas said, his gaze returning to Henderson. Henderson shook his head, avoiding Silas's stare. "It can't be just any of us. It has to be fitting, a gesture. You were a soldier, Blackwood. You fought them." The words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. "You killed them, that's what he meant." "This is your penance," Peters grunted. "Your chance to make amends. For the town, for all of us." The hypocrisy was so thick Silas could taste it. They wanted to wash their own hands of the blood that had been spilled, and they were using him as their basin. They wanted to put the savage in the care of the savage killer, the broken soldier, out of sight, out of mind. "No," Silas said. The word was flat, final. "I live alone. I'll die alone. Find someone else to play your games." He made to turn again, but Miller stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "It ain't a game, and it ain't a request." His hand drifted towards his own pistol. "The council's voted. This land you squat on, it's not yours by right. It's owned by the settlement. The hunting rights, the trapping permit, those can be revoked. We could have you out of here by sunrise." The threat was real. Without his land, without the right to hunt, he would be a vagrant. He couldn't survive the winter. It was a death sentence. Delivered with a smug smile. They had him cornered, and they knew it. Silas looked past them, his gaze locking with the girl's. For a fleeting second, he saw a flicker of something in her dark eyes. Not fear, but a shared understanding of being trapped. They were two sides of the same coin, two prisoners in a war that was supposedly over. He looked at the hard, unforgiving faces of the men in front of him. Men he had once called neighbors. He saw no mercy there, only a grim, self-serving resolve. He was tired, so deeply, bone-achingly tired. Tired of fighting, tired of memories, tired of the constant, grinding pain in his leg and in his soul. Another battle, another defeat. What did one more matter? He let out a long, slow breath, the air turning white in front of his face. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Fine. Relief washed over Henderson's face. He clapped Silas on the shoulder, a gesture of false camaraderie that made Silas's skin crawl. "A wise choice, my boy. A service to the community." Silas shook him off. He didn't say another word. He walked over to Ghost, his limp more pronounced than ever. He untied the reins, every movement stiff with a rage that had no outlet. The girl watched him approach. She did not move, did not flinch. Her expression was a mask of stoic indifference, but her eyes followed his every step. He stopped a few feet from her, the silence stretching between them, taut as a wire. What was he supposed to say? What was he supposed to do? There were no words for this, no language that could bridge the chasm of blood and hatred that separated their two peoples. He gestured curtly with his head towards the track that led to his cabin. "Come on." She didn't respond. She simply stood there, a statue of bronze and buckskin. He sighed, a sound of pure exasperation. He took a step closer, and her hand moved, a flicker of motion so fast he almost missed it, to a small knife sheathed at her waist. Her message was clear: "Do not touch me." Silas raised his hands slowly, showing they were empty. He backed away, giving her space. He turned and began to walk, leading Ghost by the reins, not looking back to see if she was following. He didn't need to. He could feel her presence behind him, a silent, burning weight on his soul. The walk back to the cabin was the longest half-mile of his life. The wind howled through the canyons, a lonely, mournful sound. The sky was the color of lead, threatening the first snows of winter. Not a word was spoken. The only sounds were the plodding of Ghost's hooves, the crunch of Silas's boots on the gravelly soil, and the soft, almost inaudible tread of the girl's moccasins behind him. He could feel the eyes of the entire settlement on his back, watching until he and his new unwilling ward disappeared over the first rise. He was leading her to his home, his sanctuary. But as the small, dark shape of the cabin came into view, hunched against the vast, indifferent wilderness, he knew it was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cage, and now there were two animals trapped inside. He pushed the heavy wooden door open and stepped into the gloom. He held the door for her, a gesture of ingrained habit that felt absurd under the circumstances. She paused on the threshold, her eyes darting around the small, dark space, taking in the sparse, masculine world within. Her nostrils flared slightly, as if she were smelling a predator's den. After a long moment, she stepped inside, moving to the farthest corner from him, her back against the cold stone of the fireplace. Silas let the door swing shut, the heavy thud sealing them in. The dim light from the single window cast long shadows, dividing the room between them. He stood by the door. She stood by the hearth. Two enemies, two strangers, bound by a peace that felt exactly like war. The silence in the cabin was absolute, a crushing, suffocating thing, filled with a tension that was as sharp and as cold as the coming winter. The first days were a war fought in silence. The cabin, once Silas's refuge, became a suffocatingly small battlefield. Every sound was magnified, an intrusion into the heavy quiet, the scrape of his boot on the floorboards, the rustle of her doe-skin dress as she moved, the sharp crackle of a log shifting in the fireplace. Each was a gunshot in the stillness. They moved around each other like two predators forced into the same cage, a careful, deliberate dance of avoidance. He would take the space by the door and the small window. She claimed the territory by the hearth, a sovereign nation of 2 square yards. He slept lightly, a habit the war had beaten into him. But now his vigilance had a new focus. He'd wake in the dead of night to the sound of her breathing, a soft, rhythmic presence in the dark that set his teeth on edge. His colt was never more than an arm's length away. He watched her, not with malice, but with the wary appraisal of a man who knew how quickly peace could shatter. He watched the way her hands were never still, her fingers tracing patterns on her own arms or pleating the edge of her dress. He watched her eyes, which seemed to miss nothing, yet never once met his. She was a ghost in his house, a constant, unnerving reminder of the treaty that had shackled them together. On the second day, he made a gesture he wasn't sure was for her comfort or his own. He dragged his spare pallet, a thin mattress stuffed with straw and covered with a thick buffalo hide, and placed it on the floor near the fire. A good 6 feet from his own cot, he tossed 2 heavy wool blankets onto it. He did it without looking at her, then pointed, "That's for you." His voice sounded like a stone rolling downhill, loud and rough in the silent room. She gave no sign that she had heard, let alone understood. But when darkness fell and the fire burned down to glowing embers, she moved to the pallet and wrapped herself in the blankets, turning her back to him. It was an acceptance of the space, but not of the man who gave it. The line had been drawn. Her territory, and his. His attempts at communication were crude and met with a wall of indifference. He offered her food, a strip of dried venison, a hard biscuit from his dwindling supply. He'd set it on the edge of the hearth, then retreat to his side of the room. The food would sit there for hours, untouched, until he finally, in a fit of frustrated anger, threw it into the fire. She drank only water, which she fetched herself in a small wooden bucket from the creek behind the cabin, moving with a swift, silent purpose that unnerved him. Her refusal to eat his food was a clear and potent message. "I will not be sustained by you. I will not take from my enemy." Her defiance was not loud, but it was absolute. She had a small, sharp knife, the one he'd seen at her waist in the settlement. During the long hours of daylight, she would sit by the fire and take a piece of kindling from the wood pile. With meticulous, patient strokes, she would carve into the wood. She carved strange symbols he didn't recognize, spirals that coiled like snakes, the jagged lines of mountains, the stark, stick-like figures of deer and eagles. When she was finished, she would place the piece of wood back on the pile, an altered offering for the fire. It was her own silent language, a way of marking this alien place with her presence, of whispering secrets to the flames that consumed them. And at night, she would sing. It began after he was on his cot, when the cabin was sunk in a profound darkness broken only by the faint orange glow of the embers. It wasn't loud, but a low, haunting melody that seemed to rise from the very earth beneath the floorboards. The tune was mournful, a lament that spoke of loss and sorrow in a language he could not comprehend, but a feeling he understood all too well. It got under his skin. That song, it was the sound of a spirit that would not break, a heart that grieved openly, defiantly, in the home of one of the men who had caused its pain. He would lie there, staring into the darkness, the sad, foreign notes weaving themselves into the fabric of his own troubled dreams. The world outside grew colder. The sky remained a perpetual, bruised gray. The wind was a constant predator, clawing at the cabin, moaning through the cracks in the walls. Then, One afternoon, the first snowflakes began to fall. They were large and wet, drifting down lazily at first, but as the day bled into a premature twilight, the wind picked up, and the lazy drift became a slanting, stinging assault. Silas had seen blizzards before. He knew the signs, the unnatural stillness that came before the storm, the way the animals went to ground. He went outside, the wind tearing at his coat, and secured the shutter over the single window. He checked the lean-to where Ghost was sheltered, adding extra hay and ensuring the small enclosure was as draft-proof as he could make it. When he returned to the cabin, shaking the snow from his hat, the world outside was already disappearing into a swirling vortex of white. The storm hit them with the force of a locomotive. The wind screamed like a banshee, a physical blow against the small cabin, which groaned and shuddered in protest. Snow drove against the door, piling in drifts that would soon make it impassable. The world beyond their four walls ceased to exist. There was no more Harmony Gulch, no mesas, no Apache lands, no United States of America. There was only the room, the fire, and the storm. They were utterly, completely alone, marooned on a tiny island of warmth in a roaring ocean of white. For 2 days, they were prisoners of the blizzard. The howling of the wind was a constant companion, a sound so immense it made their own silence seem small and insignificant. The cold was a physical entity, seeping through the walls, making the floorboards slick with frost away from the immediate circle of the fire. Their world shrank to the hearth, the flickering flames the only thing holding the lethal cold at bay. Survival became the only truth. The carefully drawn lines of their silent war began to blur, erased by the more urgent need to simply stay alive. Silas noticed her shivering, even huddled under the buffalo hide and blankets. The doe-skin dress she wore, while practical for the high desert autumn, was no match for this deep, invasive cold. He watched as she rubbed her arms, her fingers stiff and clumsy. He went to the wooden chest at the foot of his cot and pulled out an old cavalry greatcoat. It was heavy wool, worn and faded, with a tear in one of the shoulders. He sat down on his chair, took a needle and thread from his supply kit, and with rough, unpracticed stitches, began to mend the tear. His fingers felt thick and clumsy with the needle, but he persisted. She watched him, her dark eyes following the slow, deliberate movement of his hands. He did not look at her, concentrating on his task as if it were the most important thing in the world. When he was done, he bit the thread and stood up. He walked over to her pallet and dropped the coat beside her. "It's warmer than what you've got," he said gruffly, and immediately retreated to his side of the room. For a long time, the coat lay where he had dropped it. He thought she would reject it, another offering to be ignored. But as the night deepened and the temperature in the cabin plummeted further, he saw her reach out a hesitant hand and touch the rough wool. Slowly, she pulled it over her shoulders, drawing the heavy fabric around herself. She did not thank him, but in the morning, when she fetched water, she left the coat on, its dark blue a stark contrast to her buckskin dress. It was the first surrender in their silent war. The next was the food. Their supplies were finite. He had a sack of flour, some salted pork, a handful of dried beans, and the venison jerky. With the storm showing no signs of breaking, rationing became critical. He could not afford to let her starve, not if he wanted to survive himself. Her weakness would become his problem. That evening, he put a pot of water on the fire and added a handful of beans and a small piece of the salted pork. The smell of the thin stew slowly filled the cabin, a savory, comforting scent that stood in defiance of the howling wind. When it was ready, he ladled some into 2 tin bowls. He took one for himself and placed the other on the stone hearth, in its usual place. He sat on his chair and ate slowly, not looking at her. He could feel her stillness, her resistance. The bowl sat there, steam rising from it. He finished his own meal, the warm food a small comfort in his belly. The bowl remained untouched. He waited. The minutes stretched on, thick and heavy. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but firm. "You'll eat or you'll die, and I'll be damned if I'm sharing this grave with you because you're too proud to take a meal." He didn't know if she understood the words, but she understood the tone. It wasn't a request. It was an order born of grim necessity. After another long moment of silence, she moved. She crept forward, took the bowl, and retreated to her corner. She ate with her fingers, her movements quick and efficient, like a wild animal that feared its meal would be snatched away. When she was done, she placed the empty bowl back on the hearth. It was not submission. It was a concession to the blizzard, a truce dictated by the storm. On the third night of the storm, something changed. The fire was burning low, and Silas knew he had to conserve wood. The cabin was dangerously cold. He was dozing fitfully on his cot when a sound from her side of the room brought him fully awake. It was a soft moan, a sound of distress. He sat up, his eyes adjusting to the dim, flickering light. She was thrashing under the blankets, her body caught in a violent shiver that had nothing to do with the cold in the room. He got up and moved cautiously towards her. He knelt by the pallet and reached out, hesitating for a moment before placing the back of his hand against her forehead. Her skin was on fire. A fever, hot and raging. It must have been the prolonged cold, the lack of proper food, her body finally succumbing to the harsh conditions. He cursed under his breath. He was no doctor. He'd seen men die of fever in army camps, seen them sweat and shiver and rave until their bodies gave out. He brought her water, lifting her head gently. She drank greedily, her lips dry and cracked. But the water wasn't enough. The shivers racked her small frame, a tremor so deep it seemed to come from her very bones. He knew, with a dreadful certainty, that the blankets and the dying fire wouldn't be enough to keep her warm, not with a chill like this. He'd seen it done in the war, a desperate last-ditch effort to save a man from freezing. There was only one source of heat left in the cabin that was strong enough. His own body. He stood for a moment, torn. This was the line he had sworn he would not cross. He was her guardian by force, her captor. To touch her, it was a violation he couldn't stomach. But to let her die, to watch the life burn out of her because of his own hesitation, that was a greater violation still. He made his decision, moving with a grim resolve. He lay down on the pallet behind her, the buffalo hide crackling under his weight. He was clumsy, awkward, his movements stiff from the cold and his own reluctance. He reached out and pulled her shivering body against his. She was rigid at first, a brief flash of consciousness in her fevered state, a surge of panicked energy. He held her firm, his arm around her waist. "Easy now," he murmured. The words meant more for himself than for her. "It's all right, just for the warmth." He drew the heavy wool coat and the blankets over both of them, creating a small cocoon of shared space. He pressed his chest against her back, his body a furnace against her icy chill. He could feel the violent trembling of her limbs, the frantic, shallow beat of her heart against his arm. She felt small in his arms, fragile, like a bird with a broken wing. All the fire and defiance he had seen in her eyes was gone, replaced by a desperate, consuming sickness. For hours, he lay there in the dark, holding the Apache girl, his sworn enemy. The wind howled outside, a soundtrack to the strange, intimate drama unfolding within. He was acutely aware of every detail, the scent of wood smoke and something else, something wild and clean. In her hair, the slight, frail weight of her in his arms, the way her shivers slowly, gradually, began to subside as his heat seeped into her. His mind was a torrent of conflicting thoughts. He thought of the men he had fought, the friends he had lost. He thought of the treaty, of the smug faces of Henderson and the others. He thought of her mournful singing in the night. This was not a man holding a woman. It was not a white man holding an Indian. It was just two living, breathing souls, clinging to life, huddled together against a great and terrible cold, while the world tried to tear them apart. Sometime before dawn, the shivering stopped, her breathing deepened, becoming slow and regular. The fever had broken. He could feel the dampness of her skin through her dress. He lay still, not wanting to move, not wanting to break the strange, silent truce. In the deepest, darkest hour of the night, in the heart of the storm, the first moment of true peace had finally come to the cabin. And it had come in an embrace, silent and unasked for, between two people who had every reason to hate each other. The world was born again in silence and blinding white. When Silas woke, it was not to the howl of the wind but to a profound stillness. The storm had passed. A pale, watery sunlight filtered through the gaps in the shutter, painting stripes of light across the cabin floor. He was on his cot, a single blanket pulled over him. For a moment, he was disoriented, the memory of the long, cold night, a fever dream. Then he pushed himself up on his elbows, a groan escaping his lips. Every muscle in his back and shoulders ached from the rigid hours spent on the hard pallet. Across the room, she was already awake. She sat by the hearth, wrapped in his greatcoat, her knees drawn to her chest. She was watching him. The hostility that had been a permanent fixture in her gaze was gone. In its place was something else, something he couldn't name, a quiet, searching watchfulness. There was no fear, but the sharp edges of her defiance had softened, worn down by the fever and the storm. He expected her to look away, to retreat back into her shell of indifference as he rose and stretched. The pain in his leg a familiar, angry greeting, but she didn't. Her eyes followed him as he moved to the door and pushed. It took the full force of his shoulder to budge it against the heavy drift of snow outside. The world that greeted him was pristine, sculpted by the wind into waves and dunes of perfect white under a sky of brilliant, aching blue. The air was so cold and clean it felt sharp in his lungs. The silence was absolute, broken only by the drip of melting snow from the eaves. When he turned back inside, she was no longer on her pallet. She was kneeling by the woodpile, carefully selecting pieces of kindling, with a skill that was both swift and economical. She arranged the wood in the fireplace and, using a flint and steel from his mantelpiece, struck a spark into a small ball of tinder she had prepared. Within minutes, a small, clean flame was licking at the kindling, growing steadily. She had not waited for him. She had not waited to be told. She had simply taken up the task, a silent declaration that she was no longer just a captive presence, but a participant in their shared existence. The change was subtle at first, a gradual thawing of the glacial atmosphere that had frozen the cabin. The silence remained, but its character had shifted. It was no longer a weapon, a heavy, suffocating blanket of animosity. Now, it felt more like a space, a quiet clearing where something new and uncertain might have room to grow. She began to take on small chores. She would ensure the fire never went out, adding logs with a quiet efficiency that seemed innate. She swept the floor with a crude broom he had fashioned from a bundle of twigs. She did these things without being asked, without any acknowledgement passing between them. It was as if she were reclaiming a small measure of control over her life, creating order in the chaotic circumstances that had thrown them together. One morning, after she had returned from fetching water, he found a small, withered apple sitting on the wooden chair beside his cot. It was one of the last from his meager autumn stores, which he kept in a small cellar beneath the floorboards. He had been saving it. He looked at the apple, then at her. She was at the hearth, her back to him, seemingly absorbed in mending a small tear in her moccasin. The apple was a peace offering. It was a ration of their dwindling food, a gift that cost her something. It was an acknowledgement of the debt she felt for the night of the fever. Silas picked it up, its skin cool and wrinkled in his calloused palm. He felt a powerful, bewildering mix of emotions. A part of him, the soldier, the man conditioned by years of brutal conflict, was suspicious. He turned the apple over and over, his mind racing through the possibilities. Was this a trick? A way to lower his guard? But as he looked at her slender back, at the delicate, focused movements of her hands as she worked, the suspicion felt foolish, shameful even. He was a fool to think in terms of strategy and tactics here. This wasn't a battlefield. It was a cabin with a woman who had seen him at his most basic, and a man who had held her through the ravages of a fever. He bit into the apple. It was soft, its flavor faded, but it tasted like the finest fruit he had ever eaten. The crisp sound of his bite broke the morning silence. She flinched slightly, the first sign that she had been aware of him all along. He ate the entire thing, core and all, and when he was done, he placed the stem on the table, a silent response to her silent message. His mind was a civil war. He would find himself watching her, tracking her silent movements around the cabin. He noticed things he hadn't before, the way a single stray strand of hair would catch the firelight, glowing like a thread of copper, the incredible grace in her hands. Whether she was carving a piece of wood or simply folding a blanket, the deep, resonant sorrow in her eyes when she thought he wasn't looking. He was a man who understood clear lines, the stark definitions of friend and foe. She was erasing those lines, leaving him adrift in a confusing, unmapped territory. Should he keep his distance? The soldier in him screamed yes. She was Apache. Her people and his had shed each other's blood on this very ground. He carried the scars, visible and invisible, from that war. To trust her was to betray the men he had fought alongside, the friends he had buried. But then he would remember the feeling of her fragile body in his arms, the desperate fight for life they had shared, and the walls he tried to build around his heart would crumble. Should he move closer? A different kind of fear answered that question. A fear of the feelings she stirred in him, feelings he thought had died long ago. He was a broken man, a ghost haunting the edges of his own life. What right did he have to reach for any kind of warmth? He didn't know how to be anything other than a soldier, and a soldier was all she would ever see him as, the enemy. The conflict raged inside him, leaving him restless and raw. Several days after the blizzard, the sky was clear and the moon was a perfect, silver disk in a sea of stars. The snow reflected the moonlight, bathing the world in a cold, ethereal glow. The cabin was warm, but the woodpile outside was shrinking. Silas pulled on his coat, grabbed his axe, and went out into the night. The cold was sharp and clean. His breath plumed in front of him, and the rhythmic thump-chunk of his axe-splitting pine was the only sound in the vast, silent landscape. The pain in his leg was a dull, insistent fire, sharpened by the cold and the strenuous work. He worked steadily, losing himself in the physical repetition, trying to sweat out the confusion that plagued his thoughts. He was bent over, positioning another log, when a soft sound made him freeze. She was standing at the edge of the cabin's shadow, not 10 feet away. She had shed his heavy greatcoat and was wearing her doe-skin dress. The moonlight fell full upon her, illuminating her face, tracing the high line of her cheekbones and casting deep shadows in the hollows of her throat. She looked like a spirit, a being born of the snow and the moonlight. And for a moment, Silas's heart forgot to beat. He had thought her beautiful in the harsh daylight of the settlement, a fierce, defiant beauty. But here, in the soft, forgiving light of the moon, her beauty was a quiet, devastating thing. It was a beauty that spoke of ancient stories and deep sorrows, of a connection to this wild land that he, an intruder, could never comprehend. He straightened up slowly, the axe held loosely in his hand. They stood there, two silent figures in a silvered world, the space between them charged with unspoken words. He expected her to turn and go back inside. Instead, she took a step forward, and then she spoke. Her voice was low, softer than he could have imagined, with a faint, musical cadence that was entirely foreign. She spoke 2 words, 2 simple English words that she must have learned from a missionary or a trader, words that she had held back until this very moment. Thank you. The sound of it, the simple, profound meaning of it, struck him with more force than a physical blow. It was thanks for the coat, for the food, for the long night he had held her and given her his warmth. It was an acknowledgement, a bridge thrown across the chasm of silence and hatred that had separated them. His mind went quiet. The world seemed to slow down, the moonlight thickening, the cold air growing still. He could see the faint plume of her own breath as she spoke. He saw the vulnerability in her eyes, a flicker of uncertainty that replaced the proud defiance he was used to. His own hands, calloused and scarred from work and war, suddenly felt clumsy and empty. He felt a tremor run through him, a strange, unfamiliar loosening in his chest. It was the feeling of a man who had been frozen for a long time, finally feeling the first painful crack of a thaw. He was Silas Blackwood, a soldier, a killer, a man who had forgotten what it felt like to be looked at with anything other than fear or pity. But in that moment, under the cold Wyoming moon, he felt like a boy again, tongue-tied and trembling before a beauty that left him utterly defenseless. After that night, the bridge between them, once a single, fragile thread, began to be reinforced. They started to communicate, slowly, tentatively. It was a language made of gestures, expressions, and a handful of shared words. He would point to the fireplace and say, "Fire." She would watch his lips, her expression serious and intent, and repeat the word, her pronunciation soft and careful. "Fear." She, in turn, would point to the sun and say a word in her own tongue, a beautiful, flowing sound he couldn't hope to replicate. But he would listen, and he would remember. He taught her water, wood, eat, cold. She learned quickly, her mind sharp and observant. They learned each other's rhythms, the subtle shifts in mood that could be read in the set of a shoulder or the flicker of an eye. A shared look of concern when the woodpile got low. A small, almost imperceptible smile from her when he managed to snare a rabbit, meaning they would have fresh meat. It was a conversation held in the spaces between words, a fragile understanding being built piece by painstaking piece. The fear and suspicion were still there, ghosts in the corners of the room, but their power was waning. One evening, a week after the moonlit confession, the truce they had built was tested. Silas had spent the day tracking a deer, moving through the deep snow until his bad leg was a screaming knot of agony. He returned to the cabin near dusk, empty-handed and exhausted, the cold having settled deep into his bones. He stumbled inside, his body rigid with pain and fatigue. He slumped onto his chair by the fire, too tired to even attempt to take off his snow-caked coat. She was sitting on her pallet, polishing a small stone with a piece of leather. She watched him for a long moment, her head tilted slightly. She saw the lines of pain etched around his mouth, the way he favored his left leg. She put down the stone and rose, moving with her usual silent grace. She knelt in front of him. He stiffened, his hand instinctively moving towards his hip, the old soldier's reflex dying hard. She paused, seeing the movement, and waited. He forced his hand to relax, a flush of shame rising to his cheeks. She was only trying to help. Her small, slender fingers went to the crude wooden buttons of his coat. They were stiff with ice, and he had been fumbling with them. Her touch was light, impersonal, yet it sent a jolt through him. She worked patiently, her head bent, her black hair falling forward to veil her face. The firelight played across her skin, turning it the color of warm honey. He could smell the clean, smoky scent of her, a scent of pine and earth and something uniquely her own. She unfastened the last button and gently eased the heavy coat from his shoulders, her hands brushing against his neck. He sucked in a sharp breath. His entire body was tense, coiled like a spring. She looked up, her face just inches from his. The firelight was reflected in her dark eyes, and in their depths, he saw a mirror of the same startled awareness that was coursing through him. The air grew thick, heavy with unspoken things. The world shrank to the space between their faces. He saw the pulse beating in the delicate hollow of her throat. He saw the faint parting of her lips. It would be the easiest thing in the world to lean forward, to close the small distance between them, to finally bridge the gap with something other than words and gestures. The impulse was a physical ache, a raw, desperate yearning for a connection, for a moment of warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. He saw the feeling reflected in her eyes, a flicker of curiosity, of fear, of a deep, sorrowful longing. But just as he began to move, a shadow crossed her face, the ghosts of her people, of the father or brother or husband he might have killed, rose between them. Her expression shuddered, the brief vulnerability vanishing behind the familiar mask of stoic pride. She pulled back, her hands dropping from his coat. He recoiled as if burned, turning his face away towards the fire, a wave of self-loathing washing over him. What was he thinking? Who was he to even imagine such a thing? She was his prisoner, a trust he had already violated in 100 different ways in his own mind. She stood up and retreated to her side of the room, leaving him alone with the fire and the ghost of a moment that had almost been. The silence that fell was different again. It was no longer hostile, nor was it companionable. It was a fragile, trembling thing, filled with the dangerous, beautiful, and utterly impossible feelings that were now, finally, awake between them. The world outside the cabin began to thaw, and with the melting snow came the return of the world they had forgotten. The track to Harmony Gulch, once buried under an impassable mountain of white, slowly reappeared, a muddy brown scar on the landscape. For weeks, Silas and the woman had lived on an island in time, their existence measured only by the rising and setting of the sun and the slow depletion of their firewood. A fragile domesticity had taken root in the silence. They had a routine, a rhythm of shared survival that had become as natural as breathing. But the flour sack was nearly empty, and the salt pork was gone. The world, with its demands and its dangers, was calling them back. Silas knew he had to go to town. He dreaded it. The thought of facing the prying eyes and suspicious questions of the townsfolk was a physical weight in his gut. Their small, warm world in the cabin felt sacred now, and to leave it was to risk shattering its delicate peace. He explained his need to go with a simple gesture, pointing to the empty flour sack and then down the track toward the settlement. She understood immediately. A shadow passed over her face, a flicker of the old wariness returning to her eyes. She gave a single, sharp nod, then turned back to the fire, her silence a heavier burden than any words of protest. The ride into Harmony Gulch was tense. The air was warmer, but it carried no comfort. As he rode down the muddy main street, he felt the change at once. Doors closed as he approached. Men who would have once given him a grudging nod now turned their backs, gathering in tight, whispering knots. He tied Ghost to the rail outside Henderson's trading post and stepped inside, the little bell over the door sounding a shrill, unwelcome alarm. Henderson was behind the counter, polishing a glass with a dirty rag. He looked up, and his jovial mask slipped for a moment, revealing a flinty unease. Miller, the rancher with the cruel eyes, was there, leaning against a barrel of pickles, his arms crossed over his chest. He didn't bother to hide his hostility. "Blackwood," Henderson said, his voice overly hearty. "We'd half given you up for dead. That was some storm." "It was," Silas said, his voice flat. He handed Henderson his list. "Flour, salt, coffee, cartridges." As Henderson gathered the items, Miller pushed himself off the barrel and sauntered over. His eyes were narrowed into slits, his mouth twisted in a sneer. "Heard you kept warm out there," Miller said, his voice loud enough for the other men in the store to hear. "Kept mighty warm with that Apache witch." Silas went very still. He turned his head slowly and looked at Miller. "Watch your mouth." Miller laughed, a short, ugly bark. "Or what?" You gonna have her put a spell on me? Conjure up another blizzard? That's what folks are saying, that she ain't natural, that the storm only hit after she arrived. They say she's a spy. 2, waiting for a war party, hidden up in the hills. The poison was out. He could hear it in the murmurs of the other men, see it in the way Henderson suddenly became very busy under the counter. Fear was a contagion, and it had spread through Harmony Gulch like a fever while he had been snowed in. They needed someone to blame for the harsh winter, for the lives lost in the raids, for the gnawing uncertainty of their existence. And she was the perfect target, the outsider, the savage, the unknown. "Folks are fools," Silas said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He turned his full attention to Henderson. "Give me my supplies." "Now, hold on," Miller said, stepping closer. He jabbed a finger at Silas's chest. "We made a pact. You were supposed to watch her, keep her in line for the sake of the town, not bed down with her. You've been sullied. Blackwood. She's got you under her thumb with her heathen ways." Something inside Silas, a cord that had been stretched taut for years, finally snapped. He moved faster than Miller could react. One hand shot out and grabbed the front of Miller's shirt, twisting the fabric tight. He slammed the rancher back against the pickle barrel, the wood groaning in protest. Miller's eyes went wide with shock and fear. "You will not speak of her," Silas snarled, his face inches from Miller's. The quiet saloon fell silent, the only sound the ragged gasps from Miller's throat. "She survived a fever that would have killed a lesser man. She has more honor in her little finger than you have in your entire cowardly soul. She is under my protection, and if any of you so much as look at her wrong, you'll answer to me. Is that understood?" He shoved Miller back so hard the man stumbled and fell into a stack of canned goods, sending them clattering across the floor. Silas stood over him, his body trembling with a white-hot rage he hadn't felt since the war. He was no longer the broken soldier, hiding from the world. He was a man defending his home, his life, defending her. He slowly turned his gaze on the other men in the room. They shrank back, avoiding his eyes. He had drawn a new line in the sand, not between settler and Apache, but between him and them. He was an outcast, a traitor in their eyes. He had chosen his side. He threw a few coins on the counter, grabbed his supplies, and walked out of the store without a backward glance. He rode out of Harmony Gulch with his back straight, the weight of the town's hatred a tangible thing against his shoulders. He was an outlaw now, not by any crime he had committed, but by a simple act of decency. He returned to the cabin in a storm of a different kind. A fury churned in his gut, a toxic mix of anger and fear. He had made a powerful enemy in Miller, and he knew the man would not let the humiliation go unanswered. He burst into the cabin, dropping the sack of flour on the floor with a heavy thud. She was there, waiting. She had seen the look on his face as he rode up. She saw the raw, bleeding knuckles on his right hand where he had gripped Miller's shirt. She saw the tempest in his eyes. She didn't speak, didn't ask. She simply watched him as he paced the small floor like a caged wolf, his lame leg dragging, his breath coming in harsh, ragged bursts. He finally came to a stop in front of the fire, bracing his hands on the mantelpiece. His head hung low. The rage was ebbing, leaving behind a cold, hollow dread. He had protected her, but in doing so, he had painted a target on both their backs. She moved from her place on the pallet, approaching him with a caution born of years of watching dangerous men. He didn't seem to notice her until she was standing beside him. He flinched, turning his head, the turmoil still plain on his face. He began to unbutton his shirt, the room suddenly feeling hot and suffocating. As he pulled the fabric open, the firelight fell upon his chest, illuminating the scars of his past. One stood out from the others, a puckered, angry welt of raised tissue high on his left side, just below the collarbone, the place where an Apache arrow had nearly ended his life. She saw it. Her eyes, which had been fixed on his face, dropped to the scar. Her expression was unreadable, a mixture of curiosity and something deeper, something akin to sorrow. He expected revulsion, or perhaps a grim satisfaction at this evidence of his vulnerability, this proof that her people had marked him. Instead, she raised her hand, her movements slow and deliberate, giving him every chance to pull away. He stood frozen, his heart hammering against his ribs. As she reached out, her fingers, so light they were barely a touch, traced the ragged edge of the scar. Her touch was not clinical or curious. It was gentle. It was a caress of pure, unadorned empathy, a silent acknowledgement of his pain. And it was his undoing. A sound, a choked, strangled sob, was torn from his throat. The dam he had built around his heart, a wall constructed of years of grief, guilt, and unspeakable memories, shattered into 1,000 pieces. His shoulders began to shake, and his vision blurred. He squeezed his eyes shut, but it was too late. Tears, hot and shameful, escaped, carving clean tracks through the grime on his cheeks. He, Silas Blackwood, who had not wept when his comrades fell around him, who had not wept when he'd put his own horse out of its misery, was crying. He was crying because of the gentle touch of a woman whose people he had fought, whose world he had helped to destroy. He wept for the man he had been before the war, for the innocence he had lost, and for the profound, aching loneliness that had been his only companion for so long. He sank to his knees on the hearth, the sobs coming freely now, the harsh, ugly sounds of a man's soul breaking open. She did not retreat. She knelt in front of him, her hand still resting on his chest, a small, warm anchor in the raging storm of his grief. She didn't speak, didn't offer empty words of comfort. She simply stayed with him, her presence a quiet testament, bearing witness to the pain he had carried alone for so long. She had seen the ugliest part of him, not the scar on his skin, but the wound in his spirit, and she had not turned away. When the storm of sobs finally subsided, leaving him empty and trembling, he looked up at her through tear-bleared eyes. The cabin was dark, the only light the flickering, dancing flames from the hearth and the dim, golden glow of the oil lamp on the table. Her face was close to his, her expression one of profound, solemn compassion. In that moment, she was not an Apache, and he was not a white man. They were just a man and a woman, stripped bare of their histories, their prejudices, their wars. There was only his pain and her comfort, his shame and her acceptance. He saw the firelight reflected in the deep, dark pools of her eyes, and he saw his own broken reflection staring back at him. He didn't know who moved first. Perhaps they both did, drawn together by a force as elemental and undeniable as gravity. His hand came up to cup her face, his thumb stroking her cheekbone. Her skin was soft, warm. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed for a heartbeat, and then their lips met. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of desperation, of hunger, of two starving souls seeking sustenance in each other. It was clumsy and raw, flavored with the salt of his tears and the wood smoke in her hair. It was a collision, a frantic, searching expression of all the things they could not say, of the gratitude and the grief, the fear and the longing that had been building between them in the charged silence. His other arm went around her waist, pulling her closer, and she did not resist. Her hands came up to rest on his shoulders, her fingers gripping him as if he were the only solid thing in a world that was spinning apart. The kiss deepened, becoming something more than just a seeking of comfort. It became a claiming, a raw, undeniable desire, born not of lust, but of a profound and desperate need to connect, to erase the loneliness, to feel another heartbeat against his own. But even in the heat of the moment, the ghosts were there. As he held her, the faces of the men he had killed flashed behind his eyes. As she clung to him, the shadows of her lost family, her stolen future, lingered in the corners of the room. Their embrace was a crucible, where passion and pain were fused together, where desire was haunted by the echoes of shared trauma. It was beautiful and terrible all at once. A moment of profound intimacy born from the ashes of a brutal war. They were finding solace in the very source of their sorrow. They broke apart, gasping for breath, their foreheads resting against each other. The fire crackled in the hearth, the oil lamp sputtered, and the vast, silent wilderness outside stood as a silent witness. Nothing needed to be said. A line had been crossed, a seal had been broken. The last barrier between them had fallen. From that night on, everything was different. The unspoken question that had hung between them was gone, replaced by a quiet certainty. They moved around the cabin not as captor and captive, but as a unit, a pair. They lived as man and wife, in everything but name. The pallet he had set up for her was now their shared bed. At night, he would hold her, his body curled protectively around hers, and the nightmares that had plagued him for years began to recede. Their nights were not filled with a frantic passion, but with a deep, quiet comfort, a solace that was more healing than any physical release. They still did not speak of love. The word was too small, too simple for the complex, tangled bond that had grown between them. Theirs was a connection forged in isolation and danger, tempered by shared grief and a desperate need. It was a wild, untamable thing, like the land itself, and it needed no name. A few days later, in the deep, cold hour just before dawn, Silas woke her gently. He pressed a finger to her lips, then gestured for her to follow. He led her out of the cabin and up the steep side of the mesa that rose behind it. The climb was difficult in the dark, but he knew the way. He helped her over the rocks, his hand warm and steady in hers. They reached the summit just as the first hint of color began to stain the eastern sky. They stood on the flat top of the mesa. The entire world spread out below them. The snow-dusted plains stretched to the horizon, a vast, empty canvas. The distant mountains were sharp, black silhouettes against the coming light. They sat together, wrapped in a single buffalo hide, and watched as the sky began to bleed with color. First a pale, pearlescent gray, then a faint blush of rose, which deepened into strokes of fiery orange and brilliant crimson. The light spilled over the edge of the world, chasing the long, purple shadows from the canyons and setting the snow-covered land ablaze with a clean, golden light. It was a new day. A new world was being born before their very eyes. He felt her lean her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her, holding her close. Down below, in the valley, was Harmony Gulch, still shrouded in shadow, a place of fear and hatred. But up here, on the summit, there was only the vast, silent, beautiful wilderness, and the promise of the rising sun. For two souls who had been cursed, who had been damned by the world and their own histories, it was the first, fragile glimmer of hope. They were alone, and they were outlaws. But as they watched the dawn break, they were, for the first time, free. The peace they had built was as delicate as a bird's egg, a fragile, perfect thing held in the cupped hands of their shared solitude. The days fell into a quiet rhythm, a language spoken not with words but with actions. He would rise first, the old soldier's habit, and build the fire. She would wake soon after, and while he checked his snares, she would grind the last of their coffee beans or knead a simple dough for flatbread. They moved with an economy of motion born of familiarity, a silent dance in the small space of the cabin. He learned the meaning of the different herbs she gathered from the thawing hillsides, one for tea to soothe the ache in his leg, another to add a pungent flavor to their rabbit stew. She, in turn, learned to read the lines of pain around his eyes, and would have a hot cloth ready for him when he returned from a long day of hunting. There was a tenderness between them that had no name. Sometimes, working on opposite sides of the cabin, their eyes would meet over the flickering lamp, and a silent acknowledgement would pass between them, a shared recognition of the impossible. Beautiful thing they were building together from the ruins of their lives. He would watch her hands as she stitched a patch onto his worn shirt, her fingers moving with a swift, mesmerizing grace. She would watch him as he carved a piece of wood. His brow furrowed in concentration, and a softness would enter her gaze that was a universe away from the defiant girl who had first entered his home. They were no longer Silas Blackwood, the broken soldier, and the Apache peace bride. They were simply a man and a woman, finding a fragile sanctuary in a world that had offered them none. The sanctuary was violated on a Tuesday. Silas was splitting logs when he saw the rider approaching, a lone figure moving fast up the track from Harmony Gulch. It was a young man named Cowboy, a ranch hand whose allegiances tended to shift with the prevailing wind. Silas rested his axe and waited, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. Cowboy pulled his horse up a safe distance away, his eyes wide and fearful. "Blackwood," he said, his voice breathless. "There's trouble, big trouble." "There's always trouble," Silas replied, his voice flat. "No, this is different. Old man Hemlock, the trapper. He was found dead this morning, down by the creek, a mile from town, an arrow in his back." Silas felt the air grow cold. An arrow. The word hung between them, a death sentence. "Miller's riled everyone up," Cowboy continued, his words tumbling over each other in his haste. "He's saying it was Apache, a war party, and he's saying your squaw is the one who led them here. He says she used her witchery to summon them. They're forming a militia. They're coming for her. Silas." The young man stared at him, his face pale. "You should run. Take her and run now. They're half drunk and talking about a rope." Cowboy didn't wait for a reply. He wheeled his horse around and galloped back toward the settlement, leaving Silas standing in a silence that was suddenly filled with the thunder of his own heartbeat. He ran into the cabin, his bad leg forgotten. She was by the hearth, grinding corn. She looked up, her eyes immediately seeing the terror in his. "We have to leave," he said, his voice a harsh rasp. He pointed towards the high country, the wilderness that lay beyond the mesa. "Now." She didn't question him. She dropped the grinding stone, her face becoming a mask of grim resolve. She moved to the pallet and began rolling their few possessions, the buffalo hide, 2 blankets, a small pouch of her herbs, into a tight bundle. While she worked, Silas grabbed his rifle, a box of cartridges, and a small sack he filled with jerky and the last of their flatbread. His mind was racing. They needed a head start. If they could make it to the high canyons before the posse found them, they might have a chance. But they were too late. As he slung the supply sack over his shoulder, he heard it, the baying of hounds and the shouts of angry men. They were already at the base of the trail. He looked at her. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with a fierce, defiant fire. There was no escape. The cabin had become a trap. "Get back," he ordered, pushing her toward the rear of the cabin, away from the door and the single window. "Stay away from the window." He barred the heavy wooden door and moved to the small window, his rifle ready. Through the narrow gap in the shutter, he could see them coming. There were at least a dozen men, led by Miller, their faces contorted with whiskey and self-righteous fury. They were armed with rifles, pistols, and farming implements that had been turned into crude weapons. They were not a militia. They were a mob. "Blackwood," Miller's voice bellowed from outside. "Send out the witch. Send her out, and we'll let you live." "Go to hell, Miller," Silas shouted back. A gunshot rang out, and a splinter of wood flew from the doorframe, inches from Silas's head. He ducked back, his heart pounding. He knew he couldn't fight them all. It was a hopeless, desperate stand. But as he looked at the woman huddled in the corner, her eyes wide but resolute, he knew he would die here before he let them take her. "We have you surrounded. Blackwood," Miller roared. "It's over." They began to batter the door with a heavy log. The wood groaned, the iron hinges shrieking in protest. Silas raised his rifle, sighted on the door, and waited. The door splintered, then burst inward with a deafening crash. Men spilled into the cabin, their faces demonic in the dim light. Silas fired. The roar of the rifle was deafening in the small space. The first man through the door screamed and fell back, but there were too many. Before he could lever another round into the chamber, they were on him. A rifle butt caught him high on the cheekbone, and the world exploded in a flash of white-hot pain. He staggered back, his vision swimming. He tried to raise the rifle again, but a heavy blow to his side knocked the wind out of him, and the gun clattered to the floor. Hands grabbed him, pinning his arms. He fought with the ferocity of a cornered animal, kicking and struggling, but his strength was no match for their numbers. Someone looped a rope around his chest, pinioning his arms to his sides. Miller stepped forward, his face a mask of triumphant hatred. He drove his fist into Silas's stomach, and Silas doubled over, gasping for air. "You chose the wrong side, soldier," Miller sneered. Through a haze of pain, Silas saw them grab her. She fought like a cornered cat, scratching, biting, her movements a blur of desperate energy. But two large men seized her arms, twisting them behind her back, lifting her off her feet. She did not scream. Her face was a mask of cold fury, her eyes spitting a silent, venomous hatred at her captors. They dragged Silas out of the cabin, his boots scraping on the floorboards he had laid with his own hands. They tied the rope that bound him to the saddle horn of a horse and led him away from the smoking ruins of his life. They dragged her behind him on foot, her hands bound tightly behind her back. He was forced to watch as she stumbled over the rough ground, her pride the only thing keeping her on her feet. The mob was jubilant, their shouts and jeers echoing through the quiet hills. They had their witch. The journey to Harmony Gulch was a nightmare. Every jolt of the horse sent a fresh wave of agony through Silas's battered body. His head throbbed, and the taste of blood was thick in his mouth. But his own pain was nothing compared to the torment of watching her. He saw her fall, her knees hitting the sharp stones of the track. He saw the men yank her back to her feet, laughing at her pain. And through it all, she did not make a sound. They reached the settlement as twilight was falling. The entire town had turned out. Faces that had once been familiar, if not friendly, were now twisted into a single, monstrous face of collective hatred. Torches had been lit, casting a hellish, flickering glow on the scene. They dragged them to the center of the town, in the open space between the trading post and the saloon. They cut the ropes that bound Silas to the horse and threw him to the ground. They tied his hands and feet and left him there, a helpless spectator to the horror that was about to unfold. He pushed himself up into a sitting position, his body screaming in protest. His vision was blurry, one eye already swelling shut, but he could see her. They had forced her onto an empty wagon bed that served as a makeshift stage. She stood alone in the center of a circle of torch-bearing men, her head held high, her black hair a stark banner against the doe-skin of her dress. She looked small and terribly alone, but she was not broken. She met the hateful gaze of the crowd with an unyielding contempt that seemed to enrage them further. Henderson, the trading post owner, stepped onto the wagon, holding a Bible in his hand as if it were a weapon. He raised his arms for silence. "We are gathered here," he began, his voice sanctimonious and booming, "to purge our community of an evil that has taken root among us. This heathen woman, this Apache witch, is responsible for the death of Jebediah Hemlock." A roar of approval went up from the crowd. "She has used her dark arts to poison the mind of one of our own," he continued, pointing a trembling finger at Silas. "She has ensorcelled him with potions and demonic whispers, turning him against his own kind. She has brought the wrath of the devil down upon Harmony Gulch." The accusations were a fever, infecting the crowd, turning their fear into a righteous, bloodthirsty rage. They shouted for her death, their voices a single, ugly beast. Silas struggled against his bonds, a raw, inhuman sound of fury and despair tearing from his throat. He had to get to her. He had to stop this, but the ropes held fast, and he could only watch in an agony of helplessness as Miller and two other men climbed onto the wagon. Miller was holding a thick rope, a crudely fashioned noose at one end. He advanced on her, a sick smile on his face. "Time to pay the price, witch." She did not flinch. She stood her ground, her dark eyes fixed on him, burning with a hatred so pure it was almost beautiful. As Miller reached for her, she spat in his face. The crowd gasped, then roared with renewed fury. Miller, his face contorted with rage, wiped the spittle from his cheek and struck her hard across the face with the back of his hand. The sound of the blow was a sickening crack in the night air. Her head snapped back, and she stumbled, a thin trickle of blood appearing at the corner of her mouth. She fell to her knees, but her eyes, blazing with pain and defiance, never left Miller's face. And then, for the first time, she screamed. It was not a scream of fear or pain. It was a name, his name, but not the name the white men had given him. It was a name she had given him in the quiet of their cabin, a name from her own people, a word that held the weight of their shared history. Nantan Lupan, the Apache words for Chief Wolf, the sound of it, a wild, desperate, beautiful cry, cut through the clamor of the mob, cut through the thick fog of Silas's pain. It was a plea, a summons, a declaration. It was the sound of her heart breaking, and it broke him free. A surge of adrenaline, a force born of pure, primal rage and a love he had never dared to name, coursed through him. He threw his entire body against the ropes that bound his feet, again and again. The hemp bit into his flesh, but he didn't feel it. On the third lunge, the hastily tied knot gave way. He was on his feet in an instant, a bloody, staggering apparition. The men who had been guarding him were so engrossed in the spectacle on the wagon that they didn't see him until it was too late. He charged, a roar of pure, animalistic fury erupting from his chest. He slammed into the two men at the base of the wagon, sending them sprawling. He vaulted onto the wagon bed, his lame legs screaming in protest, but he ignored it. Miller turned, his eyes wide with shock, the noose still in his hand. Silas didn't hesitate. He drove his head into Miller's face. There was a sickening crunch of bone and cartilage, and Miller went down like a sack of grain. Silas stood over him for a bare second before turning to her. She was still on her knees, her eyes wide, staring at him as if he were a ghost. He reached down and, with a single, powerful wrench, tore the ropes from her wrists. The crowd, stunned into silence for a moment, erupted into a confused, angry roar. They began to surge forward, closing in on the wagon. Silas didn't even look at them. He knelt in front of her, ignoring the hands that were beginning to grab at his legs. He put his hands on her shoulders. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice raw. She just stared at him, her chest heaving, her eyes filled with a terrifying mix of relief, love, and utter despair. "You want to punish someone?" Silas roared, his voice breaking as he rose to face the mob. He pulled her up behind him, shielding her with his body. He was a terrifying figure, his face a mask of blood, his clothes torn, his eyes blazing with a mad light. "Then punish me. You want to know who has blood on his hands? I do. You want to know who the real killer is in this town? It's me." The crowd fell silent, confused by his words. Henderson, his face pale, shouted, "He's lost his mind! The witch has driven him mad!" "I'm not mad!" Silas screamed, his voice raw with a pain that went far beyond his physical wounds. "You want to know why this woman's people fight us? You want to know why there's so much hate? It's because of men like me, because of what we did." His wild, grief-stricken eyes found hers over his shoulder. He saw the confusion, the dawning horror on her face. He had to tell her. He had to tell them all. The truth was a poison he had held inside for too long. "That raid, 2 years ago," he choked out, his voice dropping to a harsh, ragged whisper that carried in the sudden, dead silence. "The one on the village by Serpent Creek. I was there. I was a soldier." He looked back at the mob. Then his gaze returned to her, and his voice broke completely. "Her father. He was the chief. He came out to meet us. carrying a peace token, and my commander gave the order to fire. He could feel her go rigid behind him. He didn't dare look at her face. "I killed him," Silas whispered, the confession of physical weight being torn from his soul. "I shot him. I didn't know. I swear to God, I didn't know who she was. Not until I saw the mark on her shoulder. The sign of the hawk. The same one he had. I saw it. The night I killed him." A collective gasp went through the crowd, but Silas only had eyes for her. He turned slowly, his heart breaking. She was staring at him, her face a canvas of utter devastation. The man she loved, the man who had just saved her life, was the man who had taken her father's. The love and the tragedy, the salvation and the damnation, were one and the same. It was a wound too deep to comprehend, a betrayal so profound it shattered the very foundations of the world they had built. A single, terrible sound escaped her lips, a soft, broken whimper of a name she would never speak again. Then her eyes rolled back in her head, and she crumpled to the floor of the wagon, a heap of broken doe skin and shattered dreams. Silas cried out her name, her real name, a name he had whispered in the dark, a name he had never spoken aloud to anyone else, and dropped to his knees beside her, gathering her limp form into his arms. The mob was silent, their bloodlust extinguished, replaced by a stunned, uneasy shame. This was a tragedy far older and deeper than a single dead trapper. This was the true, ugly face of the war they had all been a part of. Henderson, seeing his authority slipping away, finally acted. "This is an abomination," he declared, his voice shaking. "This man is a traitor to his own kind and a self-confessed killer. He has brought this curse upon us all." He pointed a finger at the broken man on the wagon. "The punishment is exile. They will be driven from this land, never to return. Let them take their sin and their sorrow with them." No one argued. The sentence was a relief, a way for them to wash their hands of this terrible, complicated truth. Men climbed onto the wagon. They did not touch her. They hauled Silas to his feet. He did not resist. He accepted the blows that rained down on him, the fists and the rifle butts. As a penance, he took the punishment for his sin, for killing her father, for failing to protect her, for loving her. He let them beat him until he was a bloody, broken mess on the floor. When they were done, they threw a bucket of water on him to rouse him. They gave him back his rifle, a single canteen of water, and the small sack of supplies he had packed. It was a cruel mercy. They were sending them out into the wilderness to die. He staggered to his feet. He gently lifted her into his arms. She was as light as a child. He carried her off the wagon and through the silent, parting crowd. They walked past the trading post, past the saloon, past the edge of the settlement where their long, silent journey had begun. He did not look back. He carried her out into the vast, indifferent darkness of the plains. A broken man carrying his broken heart. They had nothing left. No home, no community, no peace. They had nothing but each other, and the terrible, shattering truth that now lay between them. They were two ghosts, cast out of the world of the living, beginning their long walk into exile. The journey into exile was a passage through the underworld. The first days were a blur of pain and silence, each step a fresh agony for Silas. His body was a map of bruises and cuts, his face a swollen mask. He walked, and she followed, a ghost in his wake. She had not spoken a word since her collapse on the wagon. Her face, once so expressive in its stoicism, was now a void. The light in her eyes had been extinguished, leaving behind a darkness so profound he could not bear to look at it for long. He had not just killed her father. He had killed the woman he had come to know. They walked away from the sun, heading into the high, broken country to the north, a wilderness so vast and unforgiving that no posse would bother to follow them. They were two insignificant specks, already erased from the world they had left behind. He hunted when he could, his movements stiff and clumsy. He brought back a skinny rabbit, which they cooked over a smokeless fire and ate without a word. He offered her the best portions, but she ate mechanically, without taste, simply fueling the body that carried her grief. At night, They slept apart. He would build a small fire and lie on one side, and she would curl up on the other, a chasm of unspoken truth between them. He would lie awake for hours, staring at the indifferent stars, his confession replaying in his mind like a litany of the damned. He had spoken the truth to save her life, but in doing so, he had destroyed her soul. The silence between them was a punishment worse than any beating, a constant, screaming reminder of his sin. After a week of walking, when Silas was near the end of his strength, his wounds festering and his spirit broken, they found it. Tucked between two towering granite ridges was a small, hidden valley, a slash of impossible green in the gray, rocky landscape. A creek, born from the snowmelt of the high peaks, ran clear and cold through its center. Aspen groves trembled with silver leaves along the water's edge, and the valley floor was a meadow of thick, sweet grass, dotted with wildflowers. Deer moved like shadows through the trees, unafraid, for they had likely never seen a man before. It was a place outside of time, a sanctuary the world had forgotten. Here, they stopped. There was no discussion. It was simply understood that they could go no further. They were Adam and Eve, cast out of a flawed paradise, arriving in a new wild Eden with the full knowledge of their fall. The first thing she did was tend to his wounds. He had slumped to the ground by the creek, his body finally surrendering to the fever that had been building in him. He woke to the feel of a cool, wet cloth on his forehead. She was kneeling beside him, her face as impassive as stone. She had gathered moss from the creek bed and packed it into his deepest cuts to stanch the bleeding and clean the infection. She tore a strip from the hem of her own doe-skin dress to create a clean bandage for the gash on his head. Her touch was impersonal, the movements of a healer. Yet every brush of her fingers against his skin was both a comfort and a fresh wound. He wanted to tell her to stop, that he didn't deserve her care. He wanted to apologize, but the words were a useless currency between them now. So he lay still and let her minister to him, accepting her silent care as part of his penance. They built a life from the wreckage. It was a hard, spare existence, stripped down to the bare essentials of survival. He was too weak to hunt for many days, so she took on the task of providing for them. She set snares with a skill that astonished him, catching rabbits and grouse. She knew the plants of the high country, which roots were edible, which leaves made a bitter but healing tea. She was a part of this wilderness in a way he never could be, and he watched, humbled, as she moved through it with a quiet, knowing grace. He was the soldier, the man with the rifle. But here, in this peaceful valley, her knowledge was the truer weapon. The silence between them held for a long time. It was a heavy, grieving silence, not the angry, defiant silence of their first days in the cabin. This silence was a shared space, a vessel that contained the full, terrible weight of their story. Then, one night, weeks after they had arrived in the valley, the first crack appeared in the wall of her grief. He was asleep, caught in a nightmare of smoke and gunfire, his body twitching on the bed of pine boughs that served as his mattress. He woke with a gasp to find her kneeling beside him. In the faint starlight that filtered through the leaves of their crude lean-to, he could see that her face was wet with tears. She didn't speak. She simply reached out a trembling hand and placed it flat against his chest, directly over the scarred arrow wound, directly over his heart. Her touch was feather-light, but it landed on him with an impossible weight. It was not a gesture of forgiveness, he knew, with a certainty that broke his heart, that he had not earned that. It was something more complex. It was an acknowledgement, a recognition of the two truths that now defined their existence. He was the man who had destroyed her world, and he was the man who had saved her from being destroyed by it. Her touch was an absolution he could not accept, and a comfort he could not live without. It became a ritual. Every night, before they settled into their separate spaces to sleep, she would come to him and place her hand on his chest. It was a silent conversation, a way of mending the ragged edges of their shattered connection. It was her way of saying, "I have not forgotten. I cannot forgive, but I am still here." And it was his way of accepting her judgment, of feeling the brand of his sin, of remembering that her presence was a gift, a miracle he had done nothing to deserve. As the summer deepened, turning the valley into a riot of green and gold, Silas began to build. His strength had returned, and with it, a desperate need to create something, to build a future out of the ashes of their past. He felled aspens and pines with his axe, the rhythmic work a balm to his troubled mind. He was not just building a shelter. He was building a home, an apology made of wood and stone. He built a small, sturdy cabin near the creek, chinking the logs with mud and moss, constructing a stone fireplace that would see them through the coming winter. She watched him work, her silence a constant presence. Sometimes she would help, dragging smaller logs or bringing him stones from the creek bed. A silent partnership, a shared investment in the life they were forging together. One afternoon, as he was fitting the final stones into the chimney, he found it at the bottom of his supplies sack, a small, leather-bound journal, its pages filled with the tight, disciplined script of his life before and during the war. He had stopped writing the day he'd left the army, believing he had nothing left to say. He opened it to a blank page. His hand, so accustomed to the weight of an axe and a rifle, felt clumsy holding the pen. He dipped it in the small pot of ink he had made from oak galls and began to write. He did not write of the war or of the bitterness that had consumed him. He wrote of her. He wrote of the first time he had seen her, a proud, defiant figure in the dusty street of Harmony Gulch. He wrote of her mournful singing in the night, of the way she carved her stories into the firewood, of the fierce light in her eyes. He wrote about the night of the fever and the taste of the withered apples she had given him. He wrote of the moonlight on her face and the sound of her voice when she had first said his name. He filled the pages with the details of her existence, trying to capture the miracle of her on paper. And on the last line of that first entry, he wrote the words that had become the cornerstone of his new faith. "She is beauty than any woman I have ever known." The first snows of winter came, blanketing their valley in a peaceful, quiet white. They were prepared. The cabin was warm and secure, the small larder stocked with dried meat and foraged roots. The harshness of the season only drew them closer, their world shrinking to the four walls of the home they had built, and the warmth of the fire within. The silence between them was softer now, comfortable, layered with the shared memories of a peaceful summer and autumn. One night in early spring, as a gentle rain pattered a soft drumbeat on the roof of the cabin, they sat by the fire. He was cleaning his rifle. She was mending a tear in one of his shirts. The air was filled with the scent of wet earth and pine, the promise of renewal. She had been quiet for a long time, watching the flames dance. Then she spoke, her voice so low it was almost a part of the rain's soft whisper. "If you die before me," she said, her eyes still on the fire, "I will follow." The words were a whisper, almost lost in the sound of the rain, but they landed in his soul with the force of a thunderclap. He stopped his work, his hands frozen. He looked at her. She turned her head and met his gaze. The darkness was gone from her eyes. In its place was a deep, clear, and steady light. It was not forgiveness. It was something stronger. It was acceptance, a declaration that their fates were now one, their lives a single thread, intertwined beyond grief, beyond sin, even beyond death itself. He could not speak. He could only nod, a profound and terrible gratitude swelling in his chest, so powerful it felt like pain. He reached out and took her hand, the one that was not holding the needle. Her fingers curled around his, a small, warm presence in his calloused palm. The seasons turned. The years passed. The world outside their valley raged on, with its wars and its progress. But in their small sanctuary, there was only the quiet, steady rhythm of a life rebuilt. His hair became streaked with gray, and the lines on her face deepened, but the light in her eyes never dimmed. One evening, in the autumn of a year, he no longer bothered to count. They sat together on the hillside above their cabin, watching the sun go down. The sky was a masterpiece of crimson and gold, the setting sun painting the vast, empty land with a fierce and transient beauty. They sat side by side, their shoulders touching, their hands intertwined. They were no longer the cavalry soldier and the peace bride, the killer and the victim, the captor and the captive. All those labels had been washed away by the slow, steady current of the years. They were simply Silas and Mourning Dove, a man and a woman who had found each other in the ruins. They had taken a world that offered no justice and had forged their own, in the vast, silent, and often cruel wilderness of the West. They had built a life on a simple, unshakable foundation, a love that had been born in the heart of a tragedy, and a peace they had made for themselves. And as the last sliver of the sun disappeared below the horizon, they sat together in the gathering twilight, holding on. Two stubborn souls who had refused to be broken. Thank you for listening to our story tonight around the campfire. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below and let us know what part of the world you're in. Be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel for more tales from the frontier, and feel free to share your thoughts on Silas and Mourning Dove's journey.